There was no need to repeat. I disappeared instantly. Now I began to walk around the camp cautiously, avoiding meetings with Gordienko, Strelkov, Fieldov, and of course Skipenko. Hunger made itself felt stronger and stronger. Costik Suvarov continued to go to work with the junior lieutenants and tried his best to feed me, but he began to get sick often and was dismissed from the team for weakness. People became weaker, thinner, turned into walking skeletons, and some became edematous, swollen legs and arms. The death rate began to rise sharply. Every morning 10 to 15 people were taken to their graves. Suddenly Ovchinnikov died. Shigarian said that from cardiac thrombosis. Gusev, Strelkov, Polovoy and 30 other people left the camp. In place of Gusev was appointed Skipenko, and now lived with Stepan Pavlovich at the villa of the police commissar generals were also all taken away, they said. Directly to Germany, in a special camp for the top command staff. Nobody left the 13th barrack. They continued to live there, once gathered for work, but now forgotten by those who took them away. I let go of my moustache and beard to cover my gnarled mouth, but I couldn't get used to speaking without teeth, whispering. The winter was early, snowy and frosty, and in addition to hunger, we began to suffer from cold. We were given overcoats, old, torn, Soviet and Polish, but not enough for everyone. Lice began to appear again. The bathhouse was only heated twice a week, and since there were more than 5,000 people in the camp, it was difficult to get in. In the middle of the bathhouse we washed with hot water, and near the walls the water froze in buckets. Those whose shoes had completely fallen apart were given Dutch wooden shoes or boots in which it was difficult to walk, as they padded and rubbed the feet in the instep until they bled. I was concerned about the condition of Costik Suvarov. I became very much attached to this 20-year-old boy. His fate was tragic. Suvarov was not a real surname, but adopted by him to avoid persecution by the authorities. His father was a corps doctor with the rank of general and a personal friend of Tukhachevsky, and of course in 1938 he was shot. His mother, a half-French woman, a famous and talented pianist, was exiled to Ashgabat, where she worked in a factory. Costik himself was also a talented and hopeful pianist, but after his father was shot, he was kicked out of the conservatory. Having somehow changed his surname, he tried with the help of his mother's acquaintances to continue studying music, but it failed. He worked as a janitor, loader, porter at the station, and in the 40th year he was mobilized into the army, sent to a military school, and he came out of it with the rank of junior lieutenant. I met him during our escape from Brest-Litovsk to Gomel. He was then in one of the polbats of our fortified area. We met him again in Bobruisk in the very first days of captivity, and from then on. He was always a member of our little group. He was tall, thin as a whip, with huge dark eyes that were closely shifted to the bridge of his pedigree nose. An intelligent, perfectly educated, and even better-mannered young man. But the abrupt transition from a happy, well-off childhood in an obviously happy and cultured family to the life of an auxiliary worker, and then a cadet of the School of Junior Lieutenants made him a silent, withdrawn, not by age sullen and cautious man. He became sincerely attached to me, and I became his trusted and only friend. Only to me he told of his life, of his grief, of his longing for his mother, whom he absolutely idolized. I, Borisov and Zavialov, much older and probably more enduring, tried our best to somehow influence Costik so that he would not slip into the abyss of depression. We knew that in the conditions of camp life it was possible to survive the impending hungry and cold winter only with the strictest self-discipline, both physical and, more importantly, psychological. We established a system for ourselves and strictly saw to it that each of us adhered to it steadfastly. Immediately after rising, in all weathers, we went to wash ourselves at the courtyard column, did, as far as our strength allowed, gymnastics, did not eat anything dirty and rotten. We used to boil any gifts of fate. Potatoes, rutabagas, beets, accidentally received. We always tried to get to any work, regardless of the hope to grind something or its difficulty and expediency. For example, before the frost we brought a large number of boards and logs to the camp and started to make wooden decks for the submarines. We did it in one direction, then began to dismantle them and relay them in another way. Then again we redid the already done work. All the time we were engaged in this Sisyphean labour with the sole purpose to do something, and not to rot alive on the bunks in the barracks. At first Costik, after he was thrown out of the junior lieutenant's command, went with us in the morning to wash and to Sisyphus work. But then he said that he had no strength, remained lying on the bunks, and when I insisted that he get off them, and at least walk around the yard, he sharply asked me not to bother. He was terribly gaunt, his eyes were sunken in. I find it difficult even to carry my own body, not that to work, or as you crazy gymnastics to do tiredly lying on the bunk, he said. I'm going to die soon anyway. Somehow I dragged him out for a walk. There was a large pile of logs near the now empty and locked stables next to the barbed wire that separated the camp from the streets of the city. Between the fence and the street itself was a wasteland 30 to 40 meters wide, but from the logs you could clearly see the life of the city, pedestrians, wagons, children. This was my favourite place. I came here usually alone, and sometimes with Tarasov, sat on the logs and looked at life. Their people walked along the street, with their affairs, worries, sorrows and joys. Living. And here, at our place behind 2 rows of barbed wire, under the constant guard of German bayonets, there was complete emptiness, only a hungry stomach, constant lightheadedness at the slightest exertion and the expectation of death tomorrow, in a month, in 2. We sat with Costik in silence. Then he suddenly said it's a pity they won't let me die here in peace. If I get sick, they'll send me to the Nord. It's a good thing I don't have any gold in my mouth. Do you have gold crowns? What kind of a strange question is that, I wondered. Well, they say that if anyone goes to the sanitary ward, the orderlies and doctors look at the mouth first of all. If there's gold, it's like a death sentence, they won't let him out alive. And everyone is involved in it. Orderlies, doctors, police, they get the main share. The patient, without the gold, into the ground, and the gold to the left, through the wire. They have contact with the population. They get whatever they want, even vodka. It's a good thing you don't have gold in your mouth. At least we are lucky in this, we will die ourselves. And these vultures will not kill us. It was getting worse and worse in the camp. Now, every day, early in the morning, the dead were dragged out of the barracks and piled at the entrance. A doctor or an orderly would come, state the death, make a note of it in the list of names of the barracks inhabitants, and the corpses would lie there, barely covered with rags, sometimes for several hours, until a cart came to pick them up. At first it was unpleasant and disturbing, but soon they got used to it, and almost nobody paid attention to their yesterday's bunkmates, lying in wait to be sent to their graves. Cases of dysentery and typhus appeared. There was a strict order to bring any sick person immediately to the sanitary unit for examination, and if there was a suspicion of typhus, the patient was immediately taken to a hospital camp, the so-called Nord, located a kilometre away from ours. Sent to Nord had the same meaning as taken to the cemetery. Almost no one ever came back from there. Once after the evening check, the senior crew chief, Captain Zhenya Afonsky, said to me, "Commandant Colonel Bikarovich calls you to his office. Come with me." "Oh Lord," again I exclaimed involuntarily, remembering the summons to the barrack commandant only a few weeks before. No, it's on another matter altogether. Don't worry," Afonsky reassured me. In the small room at the entrance to the barrack lived only 4 people: Colonel Bikarovich, his assistant, the barrack's senior police officer, one of the rare decent policemen of the camp, and the interpreter, the chemical engineer Bocharov, with whom we used to live in the engineering team. Of barrack No. 3. The case turned out to be of a very different order indeed. Fate smiled on me again. Bikarovich was ordered by the commandant's office to form a separate work team of 12 men to load potatoes stacked in cages in the field for the camp kitchen. The team consisted of 3 men from each of the 4 rooms of the barracks. Bocharov from our room recommended to appoint me, Borisov and Tarasov, his acquaintances from the 3rd barrack. When the formalities were over, Bikarovich asked me, "Are you physically recovered, able to work?" "It's not an easy job, thank you, mister." "Colonel, I can certainly do it," I replied. Bikarovich detained me and began to inquire where I was from. Based on my name, he assumed we were fellow countrymen. It turned out that this was not quite true, but close to the truth. He was a countryman of my father. Both were from the town of Pochep in Chernigov province. 2 days later, our whole team of 12 people went to work in the field for the first time, to rake the cages and load potatoes on the carts. The night before, all of us, potato workers, as our team was called, were getting ready for work. I quickly acquired a cotton coat, warm shirts, mittens, an ear hat, 2 gas mask bags, and an extra sack for potatoes. The creditors, who borrowed the things, checked the equipment and gave advice on how to work, saving strength, how to keep warm if you get cold, how to carry, where to hide a few potatoes on yourself, if legally you cannot carry, anticipating in advance that tomorrow, if all goes well, they will get a few potatoes for their equipment. At 7:30 in the morning, our whole team, with Petty Officer Bocharov, stood at the camp gate, waiting for the convoy. Another team, junior lieutenants, was also waiting for their escorts, and a little behind, as always, gathered a crowd of seekers of happiness of 200 people. First, sometimes it was possible to get into a permanent team for the day if one of the workers could not go to work. Secondly, sometimes a team was suddenly recruited on demand for random work. And finally, thirdly, sometimes it was possible to simply join a team that was leaving for work by deceiving a policeman. For this, the policeman would whip you with whips and bullocks. But still the game was worth it. The morning was frosty, but quiet and windless. 3 escorts, in warm overcoats, leather-wrapped boots and warm hats, led us down the street, 1 in front and 2 behind. We went around Camp Nord and out into the field. But in about 15 minutes we came to the cowsheds. In the fall, potatoes were piled directly on the ground. Then they covered the piles with straw and covered them with a layer of earth 1/4 meter thick. In a day it was necessary to load up to 12 steamboats, and it was not easy. The thing is that when they laid the cages in the fall, the potatoes were wet, and in addition then obviously they did not count on a super dry early winter of 41. In many places potatoes, earth and straw froze into a solid mass of ice, and it was necessary to open the cages with heavy picks. For us, exhausted by 3 months of hunger, it was not easy. Our convoyers turned out to be very friendly and calm people. All 3 of them were not young, probably in their 50s, and they noticed our difficulties and told us not to hurry and to rest from time to time. Besides, one of them went to the nearest hut and arranged there to have a bucket of potatoes boiled for us. When the potatoes were ready, Bocharov, who had gone with the soldier to get them, besides a full bucket of hot, boiled potatoes, brought a whole loaf of still warm wheat bread, a bowl of lard, and a pack of cigarettes. We took a half-hour break, ate, smoked, and with real enthusiasm went back to work. During the next smoke break, after talking to our escorts, Bocharov told us about the general conditions of our work. Every day the Poles would boil potatoes for us and probably collect all sorts of extras, as they had done today. We could carry 2 full gas masks with us back to camp after work. He suggested all the spoils of the job be divided equally amongst ourselves. In addition, we should give 2 bags to the commandant's office, 1 to Bikarovich and the barracks police, and at least 1 to the sanitary unit. And 1 more, depending on luck, Bikarovich should be given some smokes. All the rest again to divide equally among all members of the brigade. All, of course, agreed. Such a small payment for the right to be fed did not bother anyone. We, the potato men, became the camp aristocracy. Everyone fawned and fawned over us, and a group of assistants, nannies, formed around each of us, who cleaned our clothes, greased our boots, washed and dried our shirts, patched or sewed up our torn pants, shirts and mittens. Everyone was happy to be of service to the potato workers. I fed Costik, Suvarov, Shmatko, and a couple of other people. I paid off my creditors completely, and literally after 5 or 6 days of work I started to feel fine. It was not difficult for us to load 10 or 12 cartloads of potatoes a day, to remove the cover from the hagat in the morning, and to close it for the night in the evening. Besides, our 3 permanent escorts were remarkably good fellows. 1 was from Silesia and 2 from Bavaria. The senior in age and rank, Hans, a Bavarian, organized a special extra for us. He collected crusts of bread, cigarette and cigar butts in the guard barracks, and all 3 of them emptied the pockets of their overcoats when we went to the field to work. Life had become quite bearable. My stomach was full, I smoked as much as I wanted. There was a mass of acquaintances and friends in the camp. In the sanitary unit we were received with honours, Doctor. Ishchenko invited us to play cards or lay a bullet. Costik became more cheerful, Zavialov too. Bocharov from the soldiers learned a lot of news. In the early days of December, Japan, a surprise attack, destroyed almost the entire American Navy in the Pacific, and America began the war against Japan. The Germans were very pleased. On the Eastern Front, the Germans said, Moscow and Leningrad were completely surrounded and would be taken no later than Christmas. Oral. Voronezh, Kharkov are already in German hands. Crimea is also taken. An unusually severe winter had delayed the general offensive, but in the spring it would all be over, and you will all return to peaceful life. And then US Hans said, smiling good-naturedly. Life was smiling. And then all at once everything fell apart. 2 weeks into our work, we were waiting for our escorts at the camp gate as usual. Suddenly someone took me by the shoulder. I turned around. Behind me stood my old buddy, a huge Gordienko. Go to your barracks, you can't go to work anymore. Vrozumiv. I wanted to object, but Gordienko pushed me hard, and I fell on the snow. Go to the barracks, cholera. Don't worry. Do you want to go to the sanitary unit again? I got up and immediately saw standing not far away Skipenko, who was looking at the whole scene with a grin. Our team stood with their heads down. All were silent. I wandered to the barracks. Passing through the crowd of happiness seekers, I met no sympathy. On the contrary, have you eaten potatoes? That's enough, switched to Baladu. Hey Major, sell your ear flap, I'll give you half a rutabaga, drop your bags. You don't need them, hey you, retired goat drummer. Give me your ration of bread. I'll give you 1 Grodno twist by acquaintance tick while you're still alive, or Gordienko will knock out the rest of your teeth. And all these nice, full of comradely participation remarks were accompanied by 3-storied mate and laughter. Bikarovich appointed Shmatko in my place. For a few days Tarasov and Borisov continued to share the spoils with me, but then Borisov fell ill, and Tarasov got a huge abscess on his thigh. They were both replaced by others in the team. Borisov was getting worse and worse. For a few days we hid him on the bunks, but then we had to take him by hand to the sanitary unit. I went in to see Dr. Ishchenko and asked him to examine Borisov himself. All right, I'll have a look. And you get out of here, Major. The Germans don't allow outsiders to enter the reception room. I had no time to say a few words to Borisov, but the orderlies simply pushed me out of the sanitary unit. Toward evening I came again, but the orderly, not letting me in, said Borisov has a rash. They took him to the Nord and slammed the doors shut. After all, Borisov has several gold crowns. A man is dead. I remembered Costik Suvarov's stories. Vasily Kuzmik Borisov had been my closest and most loyal friend since the early days of my military career. When I was appointed head of the repair shops of the fortification in Brest-Litovsky, Borisov, in the rank of senior lieutenant, commanded the security detachment of the entire territory of the workshops and material base. Since then we went through the retreat together and the defense of Zholbin, and almost together we were captured. His death was not easy for me to endure. The camp population was gradually melting away, no new prisoners were sent, and those who got here in the fall were gradually rolled into the ground. In the 3rd barrack 1 room was vacated, straw was brought there, and a workshop was set up to make huge straw boots for German soldiers to wear over their shoes. Apparently their feet were freezing on the Eastern Front. First straw was used to weave bundles, and then, on special pads, these bundles were sewn into boots with thin and strong twine. I, true to my principle not to rot on the bunk, went to do this work. Able to do all kinds of manual work, I quickly mastered it, and the German non-commissioner who ran the workshop made me an instructor. It was a pleasant place to work in, warm, smelling of fresh straw, with lots of dried cornflowers in it. This smell, cornflowers, silk stalks of straw reminded me of the happy time when I, with my wife, after my wedding, spent 3 weeks in one village on the bank of the Dnieper. After Borisov's death I was somehow left alone. Costik again hid in his melancholy shell. He was exhausted to the extreme, and 2 weeks of good food, while I worked in the brigade of potato growers, was clearly not enough to restore his strength. Tarasov was overcome by boils, as I had been a month before. He was a very large man, tall, broad-boned and big-headed, with thick hair. He had become thin, his hair was falling out, his eyes were constantly watering, and he was angry and sullen. Zavialov was sick all the time, but went with me weave lapti almost regularly, but also somehow wilted. Probably it was loneliness that often brought me back mentally to my home, to my past, to my wife, to my son. Obeying some subconscious feeling, I selected soft straw of 3 different shades, wove a couple of small pawpaws with a weaving pattern, and decorated them with a few cornflowers that had preserved their colour well. I sat in a corner on a pile of straw and examined my work, imagining how pleased my wife would be to receive such a gift from me. I could see her laughing, joyful face so clearly. Unnoticeably, Unter Wunderlich, the head of the workshop, came up to me and, snatching the paws from me, shouted with delight in his broken Polish German Bardzo dobries. That I'll buy fur mein pianka. Bread prazinizm. Bardzo dobries. The transition from thoughts of my wife to reality, Wunderlich's face, the fact that my reverie was valued at a loaf of bread, exploded me, and I fell into a literally hysterical state. I snatched my pawpaws from the hands of the non-commissioner and, cursing ungraciously, sprang to the machine on which we were cutting the woven harnesses and instantly mangled my work into small pieces. I won't give it to anyone. To hell with the bread, go to. I shouted, choking with laughter and tears. Wunderlich looked at me as if I were mad, and left the room, and those who worked in the workshop brought water and somehow calmed me down. When they had all gone, I lay on the straw for a long time and cried like a child, sobbing convulsively. Finally coming to my senses, I returned to the barracks, soon after our potato men came from work. Schmatko, who replaced me in the brigade, in the first days of his aristocratic position, gave us potatoes and smokes, but very soon stopped. His special position in the barracks had turned his head. He was surrounded by flattery, attention, subservience. They listened to his every word, laughed at every joke, tried to catch his every wish. And me. Tarasov, Costik and Zavialov were not part of the group around him, every day more and more distant, clearly expressing their disapproval. And now Schmatko was sitting on the bunk. One of the sycophants was washing his feet with water heated on the stove, and he, a little drunk from satiety, was telling about some of his love affairs, causing the listeners to laugh at the lascivious details. Seeing me, he interrupted the story and shouted rudely and deliberately, "Hey, Major, run to room 5, take half a bag of potatoes from Kovalchuk, and bring them here. You can have a dozen for your work." I was already in a very nervous state, and here this insolent prank of Schmatko added fuel to the fire. "Listen, you, former Lieutenant Schmatko, and now a dirty drunken pig. I'm not hey Major to you, but Mr. Major. Got it. And you can send your lackeys for potatoes well. I wanted to give you some barabolki in a good way." "Out of kindness," said Schmatko, apparently a little embarrassed. "I don't care much whether it's good or bad, if it comes from such a gastropod as you. Try to think with your head, if it is still capable of thinking," I shouted back, and went off into the yard. But for Wunderlich the lapotki still had to be made, and I got a large loaf of free wheat bread. I gave a large piece each to Tarasov, Zavialov, and Costik, ate a decent portion myself, and wanted to leave some for the next day, but I couldn't stop. I walked around the camp, and, nibbling off a piece at a time, ate it all, a good pound and a half of fresh, soft bread. The result was very deplorable. In the middle of the night I got off the bunk, and alas, did not have time to run to the latrine. At night I washed my laundry at the column. I kept thinking that I was falling lower and lower. Hysterics in the workshop, a stupid outburst in the barracks. I spread my laundry on the deck, and I sat beside it, wrapped in my overcoat. And in the frost you can dry the laundry, freeze it, then freeze it in the room, then repeat the operation again. And on the 3rd or 4th time the laundry is dry. The policeman on duty came up to me and, lightly whipping me on the back with a lash, ordered go to the barracks. "There's no other time for you to do laundry." And he whipped me again a little harder. I grabbed the lash, wrenched it out of the hands of the policeman and began to step on the frightened and stumbling, small in stature, dressed in a cotton box. The picture was probably both comical and frightening me, half naked, in an open sizzle, with dishevelled hair and beard, long gaunt with open mouth, hoarsely spewing out a profane swear word, waving the stick in the policeman's face, and him, bewildered by the surprise of the attack, retreating step by step. We were just the two of us. The policeman had his back against the wall of the restroom, and putting his hands forward, began to persuade me, "Okay, you, friend, don't freak out, it's just for order. Go, my friend, to the barracks, calm down." I came to my senses, threw aside the sword, picked up my frozen underwear and left. Near the barracks I sat down in a snowdrift, and again I had a fit of hysterics. I cried, laughed, blew my nose, ate snow, wiped my face with handfuls of snow and laughed again. For 2 whole days afterward I agonized. Everything was terribly unpleasant and ashamed of myself. Some sudden nervous breakdown, hysterics, inability to restrain myself from gluttony, rude swearing. A stupid statement, I am Mr. Major to you, just like I am Mr. Senior policeman to you, understand. Say it again. I snapped, completely lost control of myself. I firmly decided in the future not to get loose and keep myself within some human boundaries. But these human boundaries in the conditions of camp life were losing their usual shape. Being determines consciousness, this postulate of Marxist sociology manifested itself more and more vividly every day. Genesis was bestial, and consciousness followed. Hungry, angry, exhausted physically and morally, thousands of former Red Army commanders, locked in stinking, dirty, ragged barracks, terrorized by the police, were losing the remnants of humanity. Genia Afonsky, the oldest man in our room, died, and Tarasov was appointed in his place. On the evening of December 31st, Bikarovich invited Tarasov and me to celebrate the new year. There were 6 other guests of Bikarovich's choice. Colonel Gorchakov, who now lived in the former general's barrack, also came. We were treated to baked potatoes and baked sugar beets. Bocharov had plenty of bread for this feast, some smokes, and finally there was even coffee, the usual camp coffee, but hot and with saccharine. Everyone was in a depressed mood. Winter had just begun, cold, hungry, snowy. Bikarovich was sure that soon there would be a real epidemic of hungry typhus, and that then the Germans would declare a quarantine, which meant complete isolation from the outside world. Gorchakov brought sensational news. America has declared war on Germany and Italy, and is now fighting on 2 fronts. The Germans are not particularly worried about America's entry into the European war. They are sure that for America is much more important its conflict with Japan, and as long as it can somehow show itself here on the mainland, with England, France and Russia will be finished. However, the fact that the history of 1914-18 was repeating itself, i.e., the coalition of these countries against Germany, then the Kaisers and now Hitler's, did not, by historical analogy, bode well for Germany. The Germans had given a 12:30 p.m. cut-off, so at exactly 12 we lifted our coffee mugs and wished each other to live to see the next New Year. On the evening of January 2nd, Bocharov told me that I was assigned to a team of coffin diggers. This work was assigned in the German commandant's office. There were records kept, and there was some kind of order. It was very unpleasant. Behind the Nord camp in the field they were digging a common grave, 30 meters long and 5 meters wide. The hole was gradually being dug and gradually filled in. This was the 4th in a row. In a day, 10 to 15 people were taken to the graves. Usually 30 people were assigned to work, as the ground was frozen. The hole was deep, 3.5 meters, and the workers were very weak. The work was managed by 2 policemen, and for some reason the escort was increased 10 soldiers. Passing by 3 long mounds, some people crossed themselves. I, too, crossed myself. Here are Borisov and Ovchinnikov and Zhenya Afonsky, among many, I thought, taking a shovel in my hands and going down. The German soldiers stood at a distance, not interfering in the work. One of the most disgusting policemen in the whole camp police, Biryugan, was in charge. A young fellow with a pox-ravaged face, with evil, narrow Mongolian eyes. He belonged to those people who are born evil and live in a frenzy of some pathological hatred for everyone and everything. He was armed with a bullwhip, and he didn't spare a blow if he could only get close to him. For some reason, the main target of his abuse was a small, puny Karaites named Shapely. The Germans did not consider Karaites Jews and did not persecute them, but Biryugan did not care. I don't understand why the Germans are babysitting you. You are a circumcised Jew, even though you call yourself a Karim. And I won't let you, you lousy Jew, out of that pit today. You'll die here. And every time when the group working at the bottom of the pit received a shift, Biryugan whipped the unfortunate Shapely down again. Anyone who raised his voice in defense of the utterly exhausted Shapely received a hail of blows. And suddenly, at the moment when Biryugan drove Shapely down again, one of the guards came up behind him and with a strong blow in the back threw Biryugan into the pit. Biryugan rolled down, jumped to his feet, and furious climbed up, while the soldier took the shovel from Shapely's hands and threw it to Biryugan and briefly ordered, "Work." "Fürstein?" "Work." The soldier smiled, and his co-companions laughed loudly. Biryugan began to shout something in German. Then the soldier himself jumped into the pit and quietly poked Biryugan's chest with his bayonet. "Work, Polizei, work." He stopped smiling. Biryugan began to shout again, promising to complain in the German commandant's office, but the German hit him with his rifle butt and already very menacingly ordered, "Work." "Verfluchtet Schwein." "Work." And until the end of the day this soldier did not let Biryugan out of the bottom of the pit, carefully watching that Polizei work, and every time, when already really tired Biryugan weakened the pace of work, the soldier gave him a slap with a buttstock and again said, "Work, work." The performance gave everyone great pleasure, though no one dared to show it, for fear of Biryugan's revenge in the camp after his return from work. Only when we passed the gate, and the convoy remained on the street, Biryugan came at us like a beast with his whip, beating us all in a row. We scattered, and he, with rage foaming at his lips, swore, threatening to send us all to our graves. He had his revenge, not on us, but on others. A couple of days later, 2 barrels were brought in to cesspool the latrine. One of the horses stumbled and fell into the pit, plunging into the stinking sludge up to the neck. Biryugan organized the rescue of the horse. He drove 12 prisoners into the pit and forced them to pull the horse out with the help of ropes, and then wash them, knocking them off their feet with a strong jet of ice water from a fire hose. The German from the commandant's office ordered all the participants in the rescue to be given clean underwear and clothes and allowed them to enter the bathhouse out of turn. He took pity. On January 7th, for some reason the German commandant's office decided to celebrate Orthodox Christmas. The whole day was full of pleasant surprises. The rise was an hour later. For breakfast they gave hot, not frozen potatoes and double portion of bread. The whole day nobody was touched. There were no inspections, no formation, no work. Even the police was not rampant as usual, and it was almost not seen in the yard on this day. Lunch exceeded all expectations. Real thick pea soup, even with quite edible meat, and again good boiled potatoes. Everyone walked around the camp, some confused, softened, likable. And in the evening there was a surprise again. In addition to the normal meagre rations, they gave out 3 dry army galettes, an extra portion of borax jelly, and a large apple. And finally, which was quite incredible, 2 buckets of briquettes, over and above the norm, were allotted to each room. It got dark. The stove was lit in the room. All the inhabitants of our 11th sat on the bunks, with their legs overhanging, others on benches or just on the floor, in front of the hot burning stove. It was warm. Everyone was a little intoxicated with the forgotten feeling of satiety. Everyone was happy and complacent, talking, reminiscing about home, about Christmas days in childhood in the family. I was sitting next to Tarasov on the top, and he was telling me about his childhood in Voronezh, about his wife, his 2 children, a boy and a girl, telling me, and he had tears running down his cheeks. Someone half-voiced began to sing. A few more voices joined in, at first at random, unsteadily, but then Anatoly Diov took over the leadership of the choir. He was a soloist in the famous song and dance ensemble of the Red Army, and had not only a beautiful sonorous tenor, but also knowledge of choral singing and the ability to conduct. He seated all those who could sing in the right order and suggested that those who could not sing should not interfere with the choir. But listen. Glorious sea, sacred Baikal, began Anatoly. And the choir picked up. They opened the door to the corridor. The prisoners from other rooms crowded there. It became hot, so they opened the window. The barrack was the last one in the camp, and only 2 rows of wire and a 5-meter strip of ground separated it from the street. Song after song, they barely finished one and started another. Tolya was on an artistic kick. His voice sounded exceptionally good. A watchman stopped in front of the window. Another came to him. Passers-by began to stop on the opposite side of the street. They stood and listened. They opened the second window. The yard was not cold. There was a soft, fluffy snowball, sparkling in the light of lanterns. One of their soldiers shouted to the passers-by not to stop. But there, on the other side of the street, people realized that it was just for looks, and continued to stand. No one knew any Christmas songs. They sang a few carols, and then they went back to the folk songs that were well known to everyone. After each song there was friendly applause from the street and from the corridor. The soloists and all the members of the choir had probably never sung so well, so harmoniously, and with such feeling. Suddenly, during one of the pauses, someone sang Thy Christmas, O Christ our God, not quite confidently. Tolya picked it up, and the whole choir followed him. Those who didn't know the words sang without words. The light of reason has risen in the world, and the last words of the Troparian Lord, glory to you, sounded powerful and full-sounding. I saw that some people in the street took off their hats and crossed themselves. After the Troparian, we did not want to sing the usual songs. Everyone sat in silence, thoughtful. The stove burned out, the windows smelled cold, the crowd on the street and the soldiers at the fence began to disperse. "Close the windows," said Tarasov. "Here we have Christmas. I congratulate you, gentlemen comrades." The lights blinked twice. "Stand down. Go to bed, friends. Maybe we'll live to see the next one." That Christmas evening, somehow everyone suddenly became human again, calm, friendly. No one swore. No one said evil words. There were smiles on their faces. Christmas mood or full stomachs. Anyway, it was the last somehow bright day in our camp life. On January 11th, a quarantine was declared. Typhus, the classic hunger rash, and dysentery took epidemic proportions. The Germans did not enter the camp, and if they appeared in the yard, in cases of extreme necessity, they wore rubberized overalls, masks, rubber gloves, and were covered with some light yellow powder from head to toe. Death did not spare anyone. They died on the bunks in the rooms, died in the yard, in the restroom, in the sanitary unit. Prisoners died, policemen, clerks, interpreters died. Every day the corpses were dragged out of the barracks, stacked at the entrance, covered with rags, burlap or pieces of tarpaulin, and they lay there sometimes for half a day, until they were loaded onto a cart and taken to their graves. There were only 35 places in the sanitary unit, when the population of the camp was more than 5,000 people. Therefore, only those who were not sick with typhus were kept there, and those who were sick with typhus were sent to the Nord. Often these unfortunates were put on wagons on top of the dead, covered with tarpaulins, and on the way to the graves they were taken off at the Nord camp. The chief interpreter Stepan Pavlovich died, Dr. Shatarian died, and my friend Nikolai Grigorievich Zavialov died. He was a talented optical engineer, an enthusiast and a fanatic of his profession. Before the Finnish campaign he had worked in Kazan. On a classified project, he was a scientific supervisor who was exempted from military service. But he had an argument with some party grandee, said many careless things to him in the excitement of the dispute, and as a result he ended up on the Finnish front, and then, already enrolled in the Red Army, on the front line against the Germans. He told me that he had only one love in his life: optics. Everything else was secondary and unimportant. Like many scientists deepened in their work, he paid little attention to the life around him. When I was torn away from my work, I suddenly looked around, began to look closely, think, and came to be horrified by who and how we are ruled, and by the fact that we accept this rule and the rulers he told me in the first days of our acquaintance in Baronovici. For a few days he tried to overcome himself, but soon he died. He was lying on the bunks next to me, woke me up in the night, and asked me to drink only cold water, please. I'm burning up. I got off the bunk and went to the yard to get cold water, but when I returned, Zavialov was already dead. Thanks to the fact that none of the Germans entered the barracks now, often the head of the room deliberately delayed for a day, and sometimes for 2 days, the death reports, and the room continued to receive rations for the number of people on the list, so that everyone still living received a little more at the expense of the deceased. No one objected to this death. The corpses of yesterday's comrades were treated calmly and judiciously. Tomorrow's corpses willingly used the portions of yesterday's living. In the sanitary unit, using the same method, the entire staff, orderlies and doctors usually received at least double portions. When we carried Zavialov out of the barracks in the morning, I sat by the body until the cart arrived and myself laid my friend next to the bodies of the others, and then covered him with a tarpaulin and escorted him to the gate. The bodies of the dead were put on the cart by the prisoners. The cart passed the gate, and there it was met by Germans and hired or maybe mobilized Poles, all dressed in overalls. They sprayed the whole carriage with the same light yellow powder from special sprayers over the tarpaulin covering. Now 30, sometimes 40 people were dying every day. The barracks were getting freer and freer, but the food continued to deteriorate. The Germans had completely run out of food supplies for the prisoners. The foodstuffs prepared in the fall, potatoes, rutabagas, beets and carrots, froze in the ropes, and when they were brought to the warehouse at the kitchen, they thawed and rotted, but everything was poured into the cauldrons. For lunch we received a litre of stinking slurry, in which floated boiled and rotted vegetables and pieces of unknown body parts of unknown animals, mostly veins, cartilage and skin. Thanks to the very small amount of solid food, the stomach worked rarely, once or twice a week, but the diuretic system worked incessantly. Weakened organisms could not hold urine, and the prisoners several times a night got off the bunks and went to the latrine. Many could not hold it, and everything in the barracks smelled of urine. Those nights in the camp when I, too, descended from the bunks, hardly moving my legs, and went to the restroom, seemed like some unreal nightmare. Frost, a full moon with a frosty circle, snow, pale lanterns shining with unnecessary light, and strange sounds floating over the whole camp, as if someone was tapping on the keys of a xylophone, monotonously and continuously. It is the Dutch wooden shoes on the feet of the prisoners tapping on the frozen planks of the sidewalk. From the dark holes doors come out wrapped in rags, hunched figures, walk along the bridges to the restroom, and back again to the barracks. The police were very strict in making sure that the prisoners did not urinate in the courtyard. The guilty, caught red-handed, were sometimes beaten very severely, and if yellow traces of crime were found near the barracks in the morning, the whole barracks was punished by deprivation of weld for the whole day. The terror of the police continued, and even intensified from the moment of quarantine. The terror of the police continued, and even intensified from the moment of quarantine. When the Germans were in the camp, their very presence somehow restrained the atrocities of the police, and sometimes, as in the case of Karim Shapley and Polizei Biryugan, the Germans protected the prisoners from the arbitrary actions of the police. Now the police acted without regard. Skipenko disappeared for a while and was replaced by Gordienko. It was said that Skipenko had fallen ill with typhus and was lying in his villa. Obviously this was true. After a while he appeared in the camp yard, gaunt, with a shaved head, but even more vicious and cruel. It was difficult to understand the basis of this organized terror of a comparatively small group of police officers, not exceeding 150 men, over the camp's population of 5,000. There was less of a physical element to it, i.e., fear of beating or even death. It was mainly a psychological phenomenon, perhaps inherited from pre-war life in the Czech NKVD terror land, a hypnosis of fear. Even when we began to talk about this topic among ourselves, many people were frightened and with fear in their eyes said, "Be quiet, stop these conversations, it will be worse." It did get worse, but not because of the police. The amount of food brought to the camp, even frozen food, was decreasing every day, and the Germans solved the problem. They began to bring cake to the kitchen. The cake is the waste products of sugar production, beet chips, from which all nutritious juices, pure fiber, and wood have been removed. The cake is usually added to silage feed for cattle. For the human stomach, it is only an undigestible bulk filler. Reaper, with its special sourish prickly odour, was brought by wagons every morning and immediately loaded into boilers. They boiled it for a long time, 3 to 4 hours, in order to soften the wood somehow, and then they threw half-rotten vegetables and what was called meat into it. The balanda was now thick, but with a new, sour and rotten, absolutely disgusting odour. The prisoners filled their stomachs with this concoction and then suffered in pain all day. At least a quarter of the camp population suffered from dysentery and bloody diarrhea. It was frightening to go to the restroom, although at least twice a day they did a complete cleaning there, washing everything with fire hoses. Many people could not eat cake at all. They vomited at the mere smell of it. The death rate in the camp increased even more. We in our little group, or what was left of it after the death of Borisov and Zavialov, invented a special system of food preparation. We selected everything from our portions except the cake, carefully cleaned the pieces of vegetables from rot, also the pieces of meat. Were looked through, cleaned and cut into small pieces. They strained the slurry through a cloth and pressed the cake. Then again they dumped everything into the kettle, added half a ration of bread, also chopped, and half a portion of borax jelly from the morning distribution, and adding a little, to for volume, of the cake, boiled their food in the stove or on the fire, and only then ate. This process of cooking took quite a long time, an hour and a half or 2 hours, but besides the fact that the food was less dangerous, much more pleasant to taste and smell, the very process of making it was based on the principle of self-discipline, of keeping oneself on a human level, and this was of great importance in our camp life. Some followed our example, but most of them did not have the patience and will to do so. They devoured the balanda at once, and then suffered pains. In spite of all the monotony, the mass of prisoners, hungry, exhausted, in a very depressed state of mind, dirty, ragged, suffering from scabies, boils, ragged and exhausted, were divided into 2 very opposite groups in the struggle for life. In camp life, the word wretch emerged to characterize a person who had exhausted his strength to resist circumstances. These people lay on the bunks, rarely going down to the floor, and almost never going out into the yard, literally rotting alive both physically and psychologically. They were usually the first to fall ill with the rash, and their bodies were mostly filled by the wagons that were sent to their graves every day. The direct opposite of the wastrels were the so-called jackals. The jackals, on the contrary, would get up early in the morning and go hunting. They would instantly devour anything that could be considered food in one way or another, dig through the garbage pit near the kitchen, pick up any garbage and, regardless of its quality or purity, eat it. Even margarine wrappers were considered food by the jackals. They did not shy away from stealing from their own comrades, which was considered the most serious crime in the camp, and of course the main victims of such jackal robbery were apathetic, dying wretches. Even when caught in the act, the jackal, taking blows from outraged victims or witnesses to the crime, tried to swallow its prey as soon as possible before it was taken away. Of course, this category of captives more often than others fell ill with dysentery and diarrhea and died of these diseases. Between these extremes were all shades of fighters for existence. My friends and I counted ourselves among the healthy centre, those who, thanks apparently to a natural immunity against the rash hyphae, remained alive without dying of other diseases. By the way, this natural immunity was not so rare. Lying next to people dying of typhus and typhoid fever and bitten by the same lice, not everyone died, and not everyone even got these diseases. As there were already many vacant places in our room, with Tarasov's permission, Costik Suvarov came to live with us. He somehow came back to life, became a more active follower of our theory of existence, but he fell ill. For 2 or 3 days he tried to overcome his illness, but he stopped eating, only drank water, and his temperature rose very noticeably. The last night he was sweating in heat and delirium, and in the morning, by order of the barrack police officer, Costik had to be sent to the sanitary unit. I collected all his things, mittens, spare shirts, a knife made of a nail, some notes, a stub of a pencil, 3 boiled potatoes, 2 full rations of bread, and a piece of uneaten rations. Having put everything into a gas mask bag, I helped him to get down from the bunk and put on his overcoat. Costik was fainting, and then raving, calling me mummy. I led him across the yard to the sanitary unit, and in my head I had only one thought: 2.5 rations of bread. Costik fell down, and I could not hold him up. Another prisoner helped me to put Costik on his feet, and the two of us were already dragging Costik's long, bony body, almost unable to move his legs. There, in the gas mask, is bread. Those bastards in the sanitary unit will take it anyway. Should I take one ration? I'd rather use it than the orderlies. I just felt the touch of bread pulp to my hands when I put it in the gas mask. Saliva was running into my mouth, and the fact that the bread was in such close reach made the feeling of hunger completely unbearable. I'll take it. There's no use asking Costik's permission, he's not conscious of anything. Better me than the orderlies. With my free hand I reached into Costik's bag and transferred first one and then another ration into the pocket of my overcoat. I became hot, and I no longer thought about the unfortunate boy, but only about these 2 pieces of bread in my pocket. At the door of the sanitary unit, 2 orderlies picked up Costik and dragged him inside. I managed to slip into the waiting room and, seeing Dr. Ishchenko, addressed him. "Doctor, we have brought Suvarov. The boy is still quite. He has had a crisis. Keep him here until he recovers." Ishchenko looked at me and shouted, "You are here again. I told you that it is forbidden for outsiders to enter here. Go away." And when I tried to ask him again for Costik, he called out to the orderlies, "What are you looking at? Don't you know your duties? Throw this wretch out, chase him away, listen. Ishchenko, be a human being. Because he can recover," I shouted as I was pushed through the door. And already at the door, clutching at the jamb, I began to swear son of a bitch, Skinner. Bastard, invited me to play a game of cards. Ishchenko probably didn't hear all this, and I flew to the ground. Getting up and continuing to swear, I even forgot about the bread and wandered back to the barracks, but putting my hands in my pockets, I immediately remembered. I went to the stables and, facing the fence, ate the bread I had stolen from the dying man. I ate and cried, but I couldn't stop. There had already been several cases of madness in the camp. The violent ones were tied up with ropes by the police and poisoned in Camp Nord, while the quietly disturbed ones hung around the camp until they died themselves. Suicides appeared, hanging themselves with belts or scraps of rope, at night in the barracks or in empty stables. After Costik's death, I began to lose my will to resist. I became tearful. I would remember something from my life before the war and start crying like a little hurt child. On such occasions I would run away to my favorite place, to a pile of logs by the fence near the stables, and there I would let my tears flow. Sometimes Tarasov would come after me and silently pat me on the back. It always had a calming effect. Tarasov was 10 years older than I was, and he obviously had a somewhat paternal feeling for me, as I had for Costik. And yet I myself began to feel that I was slipping into an abyss of apathy. Sometimes, still following our system of existence, I began to look enviously at the motionless, half-sleeping figures of the wretches lying on the bunks. Why these efforts to preserve their lives? There was only one end anyway. Ovchinnikov, Afonsky, Borisov, Zavialov, Costik. Tarasov and I are the only ones left. Wouldn't it be better to die quietly and calmly, without any fuss, on the bunk? Or to tighten the noose around my neck with the last effort of will? I shared these thoughts with Tarasov, and he literally exploded. "Shut up. Idiocy. All of us with you have survived the battles, the wounds, Podnosy, Baronovichi, the Polizei, typhus and the stubble here. Only 2 months left till spring, and everything will be better. Don't you dare think of anything else than to live these few weeks more. Pull yourself together. I'm ashamed of you. And if I notice that you are evading the system you have devised, I'll beat you. By God, I have the strength and will to do it." Probably these words were said at the right time. I became somehow calmer, but Tarasov really began to watch my behavior. One evening I was called to the commandant's room. On the bunks sat Bocharov, Bikarovich's assistant commandant, and a senior barrack policeman. "Here's the matter," Major said. "Bocharov. Bikarovich is ill. He has typhus, of course. But we have decided to leave him in the barracks for the time being, with Ishchenko's consent. We put Bikarovich in an empty corner room. Doctors from the sanitary unit will come to see him. Maybe he'll survive." But someone has to be near the patient at all times. Bikarovich wants it to be you, he said. Ask for a major, my fellow countryman from the 11th. Agreed? There's a stove, a supply of wood will supply you with food and smokes, but of course absolutely no talking. Agreed. And I became a nurse. Bikarovich was very bad. High fever, difficulty in breathing, sticky sweat on his body. When I came into the room, he looked at me and didn't recognize me. Who are you? Why are you staring at me? Then he lay with his eyes closed, and without opening them, suddenly continued, Major, fellow countryman. I'm glad you're here, he would forget, and start raving. Then he would come to himself and tell me about himself, his family, his life, his work. Bikarovich was a colonel, but not in the army intendant service. He worked in the food supply department of the Red Army, but held a fairly high position and, of course, was a member of the party, lived and worked in Moscow, and was captured while on a business trip on the western border. He was a widower and raised 3 daughters. The youngest, Natasha, was his favourite smart girl, became a doctor, and all in her mother, both in appearance and character. He talked, forgot himself, everything in his head began to get confused. It went on like that for hours. An orderly came twice during the day, took his temperature, gave him some drink, and in the evening. Dr. Ishchenko himself came. He came accompanied by Bocharov, saw me, and was a little embarrassed. Oh, you're here, and held out his hand to me. Keeping my hands in my pockets, I answered him with a sneer. Yes, it's me. After examining the patient's stay, we'll have tea and play cards. Ishchenko, of course, did not answer. After the examination, he said, The colonel's heart is bad. We must try to keep the temperature down all the time. He took out a box of pills and ordered to give them to the sick man every 2 hours and to give him cold water more often. I had a strong desire to strike this man with the iron poker. Lying by the stove. I hated it keenly. On leaving the room, he looked in my direction. I intercepted his glance and said loudly, How about some kartishki, dear Mr. Doctor? He paused, and I added, Kartishki is nonsense, of course, but remember this, you son of a bitch. I won't forgive you either Borisov or Suvarov. I'll remind you of Koshagin too. And you bastard, better not get in my way. If I survive, don't get caught, you bastard, you coward. For 3 days Bikarovich died. I regularly fed him with water and snow, gave him pills according to the hours left to me by Bocharov. The orderlies and the young doctor came, took his temperature, gave him injections. Bikarovich fell more and more often into oblivion, and in his delirium spoke completely incoherently and incomprehensibly. At dawn of the 4th day I awoke. The medicine had to be given again. Bikarovich was lying down and looking at me intently. Do you, Colonel, want to eat? I asked. No, I am dying, the end has come, he spoke softly but audibly. I went up to him and put my hand on his forehead. He was perfectly cold. Well, what are you? There's no temperature, obviously the crisis has passed. No, I'm dying. Cross me. Say a prayer. I was confused. What prayer to say? I had long forgotten how to pray. I hadn't been to church since childhood. I crossed him and began to remember aloud, Our Father, hallowed be thy name. Thy name. Thine will be done. In heaven and on earth. And ask us to forgive our debts. Amen, amen, Bikarovich repeated. I opened the door to the corridor ajar and said to a prisoner passing by, Get Bocharov here, hurry up and get him. When Bocharov and the assistant commandant of the barracks arrived a few minutes later, Bikarovich was already dead. My mission was over. Before leaving the room, I stood for a moment over Bikarovich's body, crossed it once more, and whispered from memory, and forgive him his sins, willing and unwilling. Amen. In the middle of March, the quarantine was lifted. All those who were to die had died. The process of natural selection was over. Of course, the prisoners continued to die, but in much smaller numbers, and not from typhus. The quarantine was over, and the Germans appeared in the camp again, and in unexpectedly large numbers, as if they missed direct contact with the Red Army officers who had survived the hunger, ruminations, and typhus. Simultaneously, with the cessation of the typhoid epidemic, the jaune disappeared as well. Pearl groats, so-called shrapnel, Sometimes peas, though with worms, appeared in the soup again. Good, not frozen potatoes were brought from somewhere, and the daily portion of bread was increased by 1/4 pound. Life became better. Life became merrier. The worms in the Belanda were treated calmly. After all, it was meat and very squeamish mister. Officers always had the opportunity to catch boiled worms. They usually floated on the surface. The Germans literally rolled up their sleeves and got to work. All the barracks underwent a fundamental cleaning. Room after room was cleaned, washed, disinfected. Everyone was put through the sanitization and bath again. Everyone was cut and shaved again. Even my beard died, only my moustache was allowed to remain, and that was severely trimmed. At the same time, the clerks' offices started working with new intensity. A whole staff of clerks and officials registered and re-registered all those who had survived the winter. Every day someone was transferred to another barracks, either by profession or by military rank, or on the basis of nationality. I was called twice for the next registration, and suddenly I was transferred to Barrack No. 4, Ukrainian, or as they called it, Ukrainian Village. I went to the commandant of this barrack, and he said that he was appointing me the second assistant commandant, and that I would live in the second room. In the first room lived the commandant himself, an interpreter with a very Jewish surname Vorobechik, a senior policeman and the commandant's first aide, and in the second room, where I was assigned, on 3 two-story iron bunks, there were the second aide, i.e. me, an elderly lieutenant colonel without a position, 3 barrack policemen and a spare interpreter. Everything in the barracks smelled of disinfection, especially the hay-filled pillows and thin baize blankets with which the bunks in the rooms of the superiors were provided. According to the registration cards, there were 670 Ukrainian prisoners in the barracks. The commandant of the barracks entrusted me with the supervision of cleanliness and food issues, i.e. receiving the entire ration for the barracks and distributing it to the rooms. On the morning of the first day of my work as second assistant to the commandant, I woke up with a severe headache, as did everyone in the rooms of the superiors. We were all just poisoned by the smell of disinfection. Receiving in the kitchen, delivery to the barracks and distribution to the rooms of the morning ration went smoothly, but at lunchtime there was an incident. When the men on duty brought 13.5 tubs of Belanda from the kitchen, the senior policeman closed the door to the barrack corridor and began to select portions for the headquarters, i.e., for 10 residents of the first and second rooms. He did it with great knowledge and understanding of the essence of the matter first. With a careful movement he collected from the surface of all the cisterns all the spots of grease and poured it all into a separate empty cistern. Then from the bottom of all the kitchen cisterns he took out the settled gruel and also poured it into the cistern, and finally he added some grease on top. There were at least 25 normal servings in this staff cistern. Vichy near the doors he commanded, finishing his work. I watched this whole procedure of shameless stealing from the common cauldron in silence, at first hesitating to object, but gathered courage. No, this will not do. Pour back what you've stolen. And I stood at the closed doors. What? Asked the policeman, looking at me bewildered. Pour it all back out, equally into all the cisterns. Got it, says who? Vichy out the doors. Vin his tail. The policeman was indignant. I said, pour it all back out. I shouted, and for more weight I gave the bewildered policeman a bad mate. Who are you stealing from? From your own boys, pour it all back equally, or I'll teach you, son of a bitch, how to steal with this ladle. And I snatched the heavy long-handled ladle out of his hands. Well, what are you waiting for? At the noise the commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Demianenko, came out of his room. What is the noise? What's the matter? He asked. And when the indignant policeman explained that he was taking away the staff portion, as usual, and Cisse Major ordered everything back to the Cooper. Demianenko grinned and said, And what can I do? It's his station, he said, to pour it back. Well, pour it back. It's his responsibility. All the soup was poured back into the tanks, and then I myself, well, according to all the rules, as a professional dispenser, stirring the soup, poured 10 portions of the day headquarters. Winking at the policeman who was gloomily watching my manipulations, I added 2 more ladles to the staff tank. To hell with you. It's for your greedy belly. Eat to burst. Of course, I would hardly have ventured into such a revolutionary performance if I had been dealing with the camp police rather than the barracks police. If the general camp police, living in a separate barracks and subordinated directly to Skipenko, could be compared to NKVD troops. The barrack police, subordinated to the barrack commandant, were the local militia. These policemen lived in common barracks, and if the barrack commandant was a more or less decent man, and such was the majority, then the barrack policemen behaved with the prisoners but many times more humanely, and were engaged only in maintaining order and discipline within the limits established by the barrack commandant. My debut as second assistant commandant was widely publicized in the barracks and created authority and general approval. My own boy, they said of me. Even the senior policeman, the captain, as everyone called him, Kondrat, and he, after grumbling for 2 days, came to terms with it. A few days later, the Ukrainian village received an unexpected gift from the outside. Some local Ukrainian organization sent a whole wagon load of food to their brothers. Bread, lard, sausages, fresh onions, apples, cottage cheese, eggs, even honey and, of course, cigarettes, shandarets, Krodna Mahorka, and just bundles of leaf tobacco. It was not an easy task to divide all this wealth equally among 670 people, but after calling the chiefs of all 14 rooms and working for a good 2 hours, I did it successfully, to everyone's satisfaction. Having received my portion, I went to the first barrack to treat Tarasov, Shmatko, and other old acquaintances. With Shmatko I made peace. When the quarantine began, the team of potato men was liquidated and Shmatko became an ordinary prisoner again. He resisted typhus, but he was long and seriously ill with dysentery and became incredibly thin. He was a large, broad-boned and tall man, and now his bones, both on his face and all over his body, were sticking out in sharp, skin-tight lumps and angles. He had also developed scurvy and half his teeth had fallen off. He himself came to me and apologized for his rude outbursts, and we restored our former friendship, as, after all, I had known him since the early days of my military career in Brest-Litovsk. Like the dead Borisov, he had retreated and fought with me, and we were captured on the same day. I and my guests climbed out on logs by the fence and began to destroy my share of the gift to my Ukrainian brothers, and Shmatko, gnawing on a whole onion like an apple, lamented. Why did I write that I was Russian? My parents are from the Kherson region, just because I lived and worked in Ryazan. What an idiot. It was a perfectly spring day. Blue sky, warm, sunny, and even a feeling of some satiety. Tarasov grasped me by the shoulders. Well, how, Comrade Major, what do you say? We've survived, and you're blubbering. I think that the worst is over. We survived. I wonder how many of us are left. Proceeding from the fact that in October last year there were 6,000 people in the camp, and calculating approximately how many people live in the barracks now, in March 1942, we determined that for 6 months to the graves was taken out no less than 2,500 people. Botarov, now working as a clerk in the re-registration commissions and well-versed in German, confirmed our conclusion. He had heard approximately the same statistics from the Germans. In fact, the majority died in 3 months, December, January and February. That's an average of 30 people a day, I calculated. I wonder why the Germans, with so many vacant places in the barracks, do not fill them with new prisoners. I asked Botarov. First of all, there are not so many new prisoners now. The front has stabilized. The Soviet Union is receiving enormous aid from America. The Germans no longer dream of capturing Moscow and Leningrad, and the new prisoners have quite different moods. Mixing them with us Germans, for many quite understandable reasons, is undesirable. Secondly, we are certainly being prepared for transportation from Poland to Germany. I am sure that these camps on the territory of Poland will soon be liquidated. I have an adjutant in my Ukrainian village. A young boy, a final-year student of the Odessa Institute of Fine Arts, named Alexei B.O., voluntarily carried out all my assignments and declared himself adjutant of the second assistant commandant of the barracks. The reason for his good, more than could be expected attitude towards me was that he knew my first wife's family, had been to their house, and had even seen my son on several occasions, so he considered himself almost a relative. Agile, trim, always in good spirits, Not knowing me before meeting me in the 11th barrack, he was a convinced follower of my theory of resistance to circumstances and the system of struggle for existence, and without a doubt belonged to the healthy centre. Alyosha was a born optimist. All bad things must stop, and only good things would be ahead. It can't be worse than we have experienced, and therefore everything that is ahead will be better, was his life motto. Also, when I once told him of an ancient truth, God has given me the humility and patience to accept and endure what I cannot change. God has given me the strength, will, and perseverance to change what I can. And God has given me the wisdom and understanding to distinguish one from the other. He marvelled and memorized these words, repeating them at every appropriate and inappropriate occasion. I was returning from the first barracks and met an obviously excited Alyosha. Where have you disappeared? I've been looking for you all over the camp. Let's go quickly to the first room. You have to see for yourself. Gordienko is crying. By God, he's crying. In the 6th room of the Ukrainian village there was indeed an extraordinary sight. The window facing the street was wide open, and at the window, with his face pressed against the grating, stood Gordienko, with almost the whole population of the room standing silently behind him. Lieutenant Gusavich, one of the victims who had fallen into Gordienko's hands at a bad moment, was lying on the bunk by the window, beaten half to death by him. Poor Gusavich could not recover after that, often spitting blood, and the doctor said that his right kidney was badly damaged. Now Gusavich was looking with some morbid curiosity at the face of Gordienko, who was standing almost beside him and paying no attention to his surroundings. Alyosha half-heartedly explained the situation to me. Gordienko, as a Galician, had the right to go free if someone from the family would take him on bail. For some reason he had never been able to establish contact with his relatives who lived far away from Zamosk, but now his wife had arrived with the documents, and tomorrow Gordienko would be released. From the window of the room was visible a house standing on the other side of the road. There was also an open window, and in it was seen a woman holding 2 small children in her arms. This was Gordienko's rendezvous with his wife and children, whom he had not seen since the beginning of the COPS. The woman was making some signs showing papers from. Afar the children were waving their hands, and Gordienko stood like a pillar, holding with both hands the iron bars of the grating, smiling broadly and joyfully, while tears ran down his cheeks, fractionally and finely. Standing and crying like a little child was this big, huge, rough as an animal, cruel, merciless, and, it seems, very stupid man. Everyone watched this picture in silence. Gordienko crying, it seemed completely unnatural. And suddenly Gusavich said, such an animal and crying. It's imagined. He made a play, pity the poor daddy who missed his children. And they're probably of the dog breed too. They bite, he said it strangely calmly and loudly, in the silence of the room. Gordienko shuddered and turned to Gusavich, looked at him, and turned back to the window again. He's going to kill the fool now, Alyosha whispered, and everyone froze. Gordienko waved his hand to his family and turning again to Gusavich, said almost in a whisper, Poshakai, Cholovich, and walked out of the room through the parted crowd of spectators. Everyone rushed to Gusarevich TK. Wherever you are you crazy? Save your skin, he'll kill you. He's gone for the bull. He'll cut you to death, I too. Approached the pale, utterly confused by my prank. Gusarevich, get down from the bunk. Indeed, for he may kill you. Go to the second room, there he will not look for you. But Gusarevich, suddenly stubborn, I will not go. Let him kill, go all of you too. He began to swear. He began to swear and, clinging to the rungs of the bunk, resisted with all his might the efforts of several men who were trying to drag him down. Someone shouted, he's coming, Gordienko is coming. It became quiet, and Gordienko's heavy footsteps were heard on the plank floor of the corridor. My heart, as they call it, began to throb. Gordienko, holding in his hands a considerable bundle, rushed into the room and, approaching Gusavich, who was frozen in horror, threw the bundle on the bunk beside him. He put his huge hands on Gusavich's shoulders and said in a husky, cracked voice, simple, brother ... simple, for God's sake. And after a moment's silence, he added again, for God's sake, and somehow sideways, without looking at anyone, he quickly left the room and the barrack. What a thing! What a thing! What a miracle, said someone, expressing a common thought. Gosovich seemed to freeze to the vapours, grasping the crossbar, and when at last he came to himself, and at the insistence of those around him, look what he has brought you, and began to lay out the contents, it was at once evident that Gordienko, on some impulse, had thrown into the bag the first thing that came to hand, a large white wheaten bread, a piece of pork lard, for some reason 5 huge woolen socks, a jar of cherry jam, a white linen shirt, a paper bag of dried apricots, a bunch of home-grown tobacco leaves, a flowery woolen scarf round his neck, 2 boxes of matches. Yes, there is still God in this world, I said, and left the room. Then Gosovich brought me a piece of bread and some leaves of tobacco. Here, try a piece of the miracle. Everyone, and in every possible way, tried to get into our Ukrainian barracks. First, everyone who had surnames that were clearly Ukrainian, ending in Enko or Sky, claimed that they had an error in the nationality column in their registration card. Others tried to prove that the ending OV was not necessarily a sign of Russian origin, referring to the names of famous Ukrainians Kostomarov, Dragomanov, Zirov, etc., and the majority of those who wanted to be on the list of residents of the Ukrainian village before the next cart with gifts for Ukrainian brothers arrived tried to use the surest way blat. Shmatko did get through and became a Ukrainian, but it all turned out to be in vain. As suddenly as the Ukrainian village was organized, it was liquidated. Bocharov said that it was due to the defeat of some 2 active Ukrainian center by the Germans, as if it had begun to make 2 great demands and claims, up to the demand to hand over all Ukrainians from the camp to form their national military units. And Barak, no. 11 became multinational again. But the activity of the Germans continued unabated. Barak, no. 8 was declared an engineering barrack and I was transferred there. My old acquaintance Colonel Gorchakov was appointed commandant of this barrack, and when I came to him, he immediately appointed me his assistant. How could I miss such a happy occasion? You, dear Major, are now a celebrity in the camp, a symbol of virtue and justice, he said, shaking my hand. All those who had completed technical education were gathered in this barracks. For what and why even the German commandant's office did not know, but an order is an order. And in the barracks were Bocharov, Tarasov, and a number of other old acquaintances from the 1st and 3rd barracks, who, like me, had survived a nightmarish winter. Spring brought with it many changes in our lives: the lifting of quarantine, the disappearance of cake from our diet, a sharp decrease in mortality, some increase in rations, and certainly a noticeable improvement in their quality. But the most important thing was that the Central Camp Police suddenly began to lose its power and authority. Several reasons probably contributed to this. Gusev, Strelkov, Polovoy, and several other encavidists, as they were called, had left the camp even before the quarantine. Skipenko was obviously seriously ill. He rarely came out of his villa, and if he did crawl out into the camp yard, he walked slowly, with difficulty, leaning on a stick. Gordienko was released soon after the sensational incident in the Ukrainian barracks, with the loss of the central leadership. The barrack police was under the full control of the commandants, and the general camp police had to act more cautiously, because in the yard there was always a noticeable presence of German personnel from the camp administration, and many of them had a very negative attitude to the traditional methods of the police with the use of sticks, whips and bulls. But the mass of prisoners after the winter natural selection was already in a completely different mood. Somehow the pathological fear of the polizei disappeared, the hypnosis of their totalitarian power dissipated. Obviously this natural selection was not only physical, but also spiritual. The prisoners began to consider themselves again, to feel not dying wretches, but recovering people. It began with a very revealing incident that took place in Barrack 8, just when the Ukrainian village was being formed in Barrack 11. Camp policeman Stasiuk in the barracks corridor picked on some prisoner and hit him on the face. And the unbelievable happened, Mr. Prisoner answered, Mr. Policeman with a slap. Enraged Stasiuk rushed to beat the prisoner, but ran into the fists of a whole group of his comrades in arms. Moreover, the exit from the barracks was blocked by a crowd of prisoners and demanded that the policeman apologize. If you don't apologize, we won't let you out alive. Stasiuk had no choice. But when, having jumped out of the barrack and immediately ran to the neighboring barrack 6, where the police were, He returned from there with reinforcements of several Polizei armed with whips to retaliate and suppress the revolution. The unbelievable happened again. 30 or more prisoners, armed with sticks, planks, pokers, and weighty stones, poured out onto the porch of the barracks. The policemen did not dare to open hostilities, and with swearing and threats, to the laughter and hooting of the crowd of prisoners, they retreated. This incident sharply, immediately and irreversibly undermined the authority of the central authority in the camp. The arbitrariness and terror of the Polizei, in the atmosphere of which we all lived for half a year, was ordered to live for a long time. Semi-officially, it was announced that there was an opportunity to enroll in guard units formed by the Germans from prisoners. Bocharov brought this news to our barracks, and several people went to the German commandant's office to smell what it smells like. When they came back, they told us to protect the main supply arteries of the Eastern Front, which passed through a number of German-occupied countries: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Poland, and Western Ukraine. The German command decided to create security units from volunteers, mainly Soviet prisoners of war. Railroad stations, bridges, and main highways were to be the objects of protection for these units. The entire command, of course, was German, and the volunteers who agreed to enlist in these units could only be ordinary soldiers, regardless of their rank and file in the Red Army. Nominally, they received release from captivity, but they became members of the German armed forces. This, of course, was a way behind the wire, but only a small number of prisoners decided to use this door in the wire fence. From the whole camp, no more than 200 or at most 250 men went to volunteer. Volunteers who were accepted after passing some kind of commission were immediately transferred to the Nord to be prepared to be sent to a unit. Another opportunity to get out of the camp appeared. One day Gorchakov called me aside and told me that for 2 days the German commandant's office would be manned by 2 representatives of a Russian anti-communist organization who had come here to recruit for the Russian Liberation Army. I will go and talk to them and try to find out what kind of people they are, who they represent, and what they offer. I think you should meet with these representatives as well. He went away. On his return, Gorchakov said to me, I had a strange impression of this meeting. 2 elderly men, officers, white emigrants, in my opinion, very little familiar with Soviet reality, but politically they are frozen at the level of the Civil War. They are recruiting people for the Russian army being organized in Germany to fight communism in Russia. The common goal is to return to the Russia that perished in 1917. 1. Indivisible, orthodox Russia. It all seems anachronistic to me. It doesn't fit. But you should still go to them. Your perception will be interesting. Bocharov, our regular informant about what is being done German level, could learn not too much about this organization. There is such a Major Smyslovsky Ragnau. He is Russian by birth, but in German military service, and with the permission of the Wehrmacht and Hitler's government, he is now trying to create separate Russian units, and then a whole army to fight the Soviets. It is said that it already has almost 20,000 men under arms. The organization is very Russian, very conservative, and at the top is all white immigrant. I still decided to go to the reception, but while I was getting ready, the representatives had already left. The same Bocharov said that only 37 people from the whole camp agreed to join this organization. Alyosha also got into our engineering barracks. The Germans recognized that a student who had actually finished his studies and was already working on his diploma was a person with completed technical education. Alyosha, saying, however, that he was an architect, concealed that he was an artist-architect and not an architect-builder. But in any case, from the first day of his stay in our barracks, he again zealously began to work as adjutant to the assistant commandant of the barracks. In the second half of April, it was officially announced that on the following Monday our camp would be closed and the entire prisoner population would be transferred to Camp Nord for 2 or 3 days for shipment to Germany. And on Sunday, early in the morning, even before rising, I was awakened by Alyosha. Get up quickly, Major. Do you know what happened? Biryugan Tolka was killed. At night in the restroom. The camp is full of Germans. Gecker is here. Skipenko crawled out. Who killed him? How was he killed? I asked, hurriedly dressing. I don't know. I don't know. Killed. That's all. I went out to the porch of the barracks. There was already a crowd of curious people standing there. The latrine was cordoned off by soldiers and the local city police. No one was allowed in, and anyone needing to visit this establishment was directed to the open latrine behind the stables. For at least an hour and a half the Germans were doing something in the restroom. A photographer came. Some civil servants, officers with SS badges came in and out. Then they carried out the body of the murdered man wrapped in a blanket on a stretcher, put it in a car and took it away. The distribution of the morning rations was delayed. The whole camp was lined up in the courtyard, and Commandant Gecker said through an interpreter, "Tonight one of you now standing in formation brutally murdered and then abused the body of one of your own police administrators. This is a crime and therefore we will take all measures to identify the perpetrator or perpetrators. The case has been referred to special organizations and the killers will be found and punished. I warn you that if any of you have any information about this crime, you must immediately report it to me or to your internal police chief, Mr. Skipenko. Those who know anything about the case but conceal their knowledge will be regarded as accomplices to the crime and will be punished in the same way as the murderers themselves." We were disbanded, we were given morning rations, but German soldiers remained standing guard at the latrine until noon. The Germans were still going there, inspecting, checking, measuring and photographing something. Of course, the whole day in the camp only talked about Biryugan's murder. Gradually, the whole picture of what had happened became clear. Biryugan was on night duty. Apparently, shortly before dawn, near the restroom, he was attacked by several men, dragged him into the restroom, tied his mouth and beat him brutally. Biryugan had both arms broken, his shin broken, his ear torn off, his nose broken, and his whole body bruised. He must have been beaten for quite a long time, but not to death. Then Biryugan was lowered, with his hands tied behind his back, head down into one of the glasses of the latrine, so that he was chest deep in the contents of the pit, and he died, drowning in the slurry. An inscription was written on the wall in charcoal: "To all creeps the same fate. The first visitors to the latrine in the morning found human legs sticking out of the point, tied with a belt to a wooden bar, and informed the police officers on duty." The belt with which the body was tied in a suspended position was Biryugan's own belt. Everyone expected some special action on the part of the German command, but nothing happened. On Monday morning, after the distribution of rations, everyone was organized with things, and the whole camp, having marched in a long column through the streets of the town, found itself in Camp Nord. This whole incident was forgotten by the Germans. Even no one was summoned for interrogation. Obviously, the death of a camp policeman was of very little interest and concern to them. But on our camp police, the Skipenkov gang, the camp NKVD, Biryugan's murder made a stunning impression. When we moved to Nord, all the policemen of the main camp were out of order here. In Nord, we had our own police. Skipenko and his companions locked themselves in their assigned room, and if they went to the restroom or to the kitchen for rations, they always went out in groups of 4 or 5 people, accompanied by whistling and shouts of "all foul beasts have the same fate." Who were the murderous avengers remained unknown. They, the participants in this act, knew how to keep a secret. Now all the prisoners, those who had come from the main camp, and those who were residents of the Nord, were divided into 3 main groups. The first, the smallest, 300 or a little more people, were called volunteers. These were prisoners who had agreed to go to auxiliary units of the German army for guard duty. They lived in 2 separate barracks, were fed much better, and dressed in Polish military uniforms. After a few days, the volunteers were to be taken to a special camp for recuperation, training and preparation for service. The second group was called specialists, and all prisoners with any civilian specialty were enrolled here. In the group, where of course I and all my acquaintances and friends were included, there were a little less than 1,000 people. And finally, in the third, the largest group, there were professional military personnel, totaling 1,500 or more, and this group was dubbed soldiers. At Nord, we went through a series of procedures: baths, sanitization and haircuts. Then everyone was exchanged for underwear and uniforms. The underwear was old, often holey, but cleanly washed. The uniforms were varied, but mostly Polish army, also not new, but also clean, washed and disinfected. We did not get overcoats. It was beginning to lay. Shoes were issued as well, soldiers' boots in relatively decent condition. Finally, everyone's personal belongings were checked, taking away anything that could be used as a tool or weapon, and new Polish army woks and spoons were issued to everyone. Canned cans, homemade woks and bowls, homemade spoons and all other homemade utensils were requisitioned and thrown away. All this preparation for shipment to Germany took 3 days. The day before departure, an agitated Tarasov came to me and said, "Listen, if I am not suffering from hallucinations, I just saw Vasya Borisov. We were passing in formation of volunteers, and I give my head for sure he was in the formation." "It can't be. Borisov is dead," I snapped out of my seat. "Let's go and see him," and I ran to the barracks of the volunteers. These 2 barracks were separated from the rest of the camp by a fence, but the wicket was not guarded and one could walk through it without hindrance. But here there was a real military discipline. At the doors of all the rooms there were watchmen, and the entrance to the rooms was forbidden to outsiders. When I asked if there was a prisoner named Borisov here, I was offered to go to the company clerk. I found him. Borisov. "We have 2 with that surname," said the clerk, looking through the lists. "Is there a Vasily Kuzmich Borisov?" "There is one, in the 2nd room." "Ask the duty officer to summon him." In a few minutes we were clutching each other in our arms, kissing each other, shaking hands, hugging again, and kissing again, with tears and laughter at the same time. At last, having recovered a little, and calmed down after seeing Borisov revived, I asked reproachfully, "If you are alive, why didn't you come to me? You knew, didn't you, that our whole camp had been transferred here as early as the 3rd day? I had accurate information that you, brother, were already buried on the graves. Well, I didn't want to worry again. It turned out that one of the residents of the 1st barracks, Captain Gordienko, when he got to the Nord, told Borisov that he and Zavialov themselves had put my body on the cart with the corpses when I died of typhus. It was this Gordienko who helped me carry and put the dead Zavialov on the cart with the corpses to be poisoned for graves. Gordienko confused me, the living one, with the dead Zavialov. Well, you're so tenacious. I buried you twice, and you've risen again without noticing it. We began to say you to each other, using just the first name." Borisov told his story when he was brought to Nord. Dying in heat and delirium, he found himself in a barracks where 40 prisoners lay on bunks, living out their last hours. No doctors or orderlies entered the barracks, but only gravediggers from the dead room, to take out the already dead. No medical care existed in this barracks. Not even water was served by anyone who asked for a thread in the heat. Everyone was effectively already crossed off the lists of the living. And I survived. Came to my senses, sat on the bunk, looked around. Moaning, raving, squirming, screaming, crying. It was hell. And no one but us dying wretches. I felt dizzy. At first I couldn't get up then, wobbling and holding on to anything. I moved towards the open door of the barracks. I found a piece of bread near one of the dying men, and a couple of potatoes near the other, crushed both in a moment. I was as hungry as a wolf, drank water from the cistern by the door, and crawled out onto the porch. An orderly passing by found me. He was very surprised, kind of disappointed that I had survived. Jumped out of the adopted routine. The rules were that I had to be poisoned in the pit from the barracks of the dying, and I now found myself a convalescent. A rare exception. There were not many like me. The convalescent barrack was almost empty, and they fed there decently. So I survived. I told Borisov about what was happening in the main camp after his death. About the Ukrainian barrack, about Gordienko, the engineering barrack, the revolution of the residents of Barrack 8, the fall in the prestige of the police, the holes in the wire fence, and finally the murder of Biryugan. It turned out that these spring revolutionary sentiments appeared here in Camp Nord as well. We also had one encavedist killed last week. In the bathhouse, when he was washing, someone closed the cold water faucet and fully opened the hot water. Completely scalded, died a few hours later. The police here too have staggered, frightened, and very limited their activities. Borisov fell silent, and I myself did not want to begin to question him about the main thing. He was well, cleanly and even dapperly dressed, looked well, was certainly well fed, and the kit set from which he treated me to a smoke was full of tobacco. Well, he asked me. Well, what, don't play hide and seek? Ask, there's nothing to ask. You can see everything. You're clean. You've got a thick cassette. You've got a full pouch. Are you judging? No, I just don't understand. Why? Weren't you in a hurry? I was disgusted at this sudden transformation of Borisov, whom I had known for nearly a year and had always been accustomed to respect as a very principled man, into Borisov, whose actions I could not justify. All right, I'll explain why. Listen. He, somewhat worried and sometimes repeating himself, said to me it happened like this. When I was lying in the convalescent barracks, I was determined that I would take the first opportunity I could get off the wire. I could no longer even think about life in the camp in the cold, hunger, among the dying, downcast, demoralized, intimidated, will-less wretches or jackals under the whip or the bull. A gang of scoundrels, sadists or incavadists. Home, there to the motherland, I decided to return. Only if Stalin and his oprichnina were not there. You and I know very well what is there in the SS, but what do we know about Europe, Hitler, and its National Socialism? Only what was written in Pravda. Isn't that too little to choose and define our own place in all this Katowice? I want to know. Here we are blind and deaf, and in order to see and hear, one must be on the other side of the wire fences and the line of bayonets of the watchmen. Only then you can, having understood what is happening in the world, find a place for yourself. For us, the Germans are the enemy. They contributed to the deaths of probably hundreds of thousands of people like you and me, only less fortunate or weaker. But why did it happen? You're not military and probably don't understand much, and we cadres were educated a long time ago. The Criminal Code, Article 193, Paragraph 22, says abandonment of a combat position or surrendering to the enemy without a direct order from a superior officer is punishable by firing squad. And in special circulars of the Military Legal Department of the Red Army, it is stated the Soviet Union did not agree with the basic provisions of the International Convention of the Red Cross in 1929 and refused to recognize their legality. As a consequence, soldiers and commanders of the Red Army and Navy do not have the status of prisoner of war in case of being captured by the enemy, with all the ensuing consequences. This I quote from memory, but almost exactly. We've heard it many times in political training. Understand? They, there in the Kremlin, have absolved the Germans of responsibility for our lives. And are the Germans our enemies? If they're enemies of Stalin and all his gang, they're my allies. I can't understand anything here in this pit, let alone decide. So I'm coming to the surface. To decide. Come with me, Nikolaevich. Where are you going? To work at some factory. 12 to 14 hours a day, and then to a barracks, certainly surrounded by wire, to sleep and work again? Here we are crazy about hunger and idleness, and there you will be crazy about slave labor and malnutrition. The Germans won't feed their slaves patties. I'll be able to decide something myself, and you'll be dependent again on the Germans' decision or someone else's depending on the outcome of the war. But I was not ready for such a step. We parted with Borisov. For him the main thing was to go free, and through what doors was of secondary importance. For me, even recognizing the logic of his thinking, what doors was of primary importance. The next day in the morning, right after breakfast, our group of specialists was lined up in the camp yard with things. And after a thorough name check, the column, passing through the city along the same path, past the town hall with a tower and a wide porch, by which we came to the railway station Zamosk. 40 men each were loaded into freight cars. To our bewilderment, together with us specialists, the whole Skipensky gang was loaded into one of the wagons, but without Skipenko himself. They said that he was so sick that he was left in the camp infirmary. Apparently these too were considered specialists. Someone remarked, specialists, professionals, they are directly sent to work for the Gestapo. During the inspection, before the column left the camp, each prisoner of our group of specialists was given a hard cardboard card with his name, military rank and number. My number would be I-7172. The doors of the cars were pushed open and locked, but the shutters on the windows, braided with barbed wire, were left open. The train moved on to Germany. It was April 26, 1942.